So without further ado, I give the floor to Ambassador Thomas Greminger, Secretary General of the OSCE. Thomas, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto. President Ceretelli, dear George, Secretary General Montella, dear Roberto, Vice Presidents, dear committee chairs, dear colleagues. First of all, George, thank you so much for your kind introductory remarks. It's a great pleasure for me to join you in today's meeting, even if, given the exceptional circumstances, it has to be held virtually. But I guess we are all getting used to these kinds of online encounters. COVID-19 is putting multilateral diplomacy to the test, including for the OSCE and the PA. So I'm very pleased that we have this opportunity to exchange views about how the crisis is affecting our region. I will start by sharing some general reflections on the challenges that the multilateral order currently faces. I will then go on to discuss how the pandemic is affecting the work of the OSCE and how we as an organization, how we have responded. What is now clear is that the COVID-19 pandemic is a major geopolitical event, an event of historical proportions. A pandemic is obviously never welcome, but this one has arrived at a very delicate juncture. The multilateral system was already under enormous strain, with tensions and mistrust already growing for quite some time. Unfortunately, our region has been the hardest hit by COVID-19. As of now, OSCE participating states account for more than 70% of confirmed cases and 80% of death. This represents an enormous loss. It is clear that the pandemic will leave us with many challenges and uncertainties. However, two entirely contradictory visions on the way forward seem to be emerging. On the one hand, many political leaders are prioritizing national interests, unilateral approaches, and calling for a return to isolationism. This approach clearly prevailed in the COVID response of most states in the very first weeks. Well, this sort of behavior is a serious blow to the ethics of togetherness that underlies our multilateral and cooperative international order. On the other hand, many leading figures are calling for strengthening our multilateral system. And in Europe, some are calling for further integration. Paolo Gentiloni, former Italian Prime Minister and now EU Commissioner for the Economy, recently put it quite brilliantly. And I quote, 90 years ago, we had a Great Depression. 10 years ago, the Great Recession. And now we need to avoid the Great Fragmentation. End of quote. Isolationism and multilateralism are clearly incompatible. So we find ourselves at a crossroad. Will a me first world prevail, or will multilateralism be revitalized? I think the jury is not out yet. It is simply too soon to tell. What is clear, however, is that the pandemic will have far-reaching consequences beyond the realm of public health. With half of humanity under lockdown, unemployment is skyrocketing and millions face economic hardship. Democracy has come under pressure and temporary limitations on human rights and fundamental freedoms have not always been proportionate. These are all triggers that could spark social unrest and political instability. They could also fuel existing conflicts or set off new ones. The pandemic has also accelerated existing trends affecting security, such as growing distrust and polarization between and also within states, increasing tensions between the US and China, the growing role of digitalization and new technologies. Clearly, the internet saved our economies from total collapse under lockdown. But the way some countries are using artificial intelligence and big data to control the spread of the virus raises important questions about their compatibility with basic human rights, including privacy. Another important lesson we have learned from COVID-19 is that we must pay more attention to long-term planning. States and international organizations alike need to put more emphasis on long-term thinking and strategic forecasting. We need to be ready to expect the unexpected. Whether the next crisis we face is a climate change-related extreme event, a nuclear incident, an act of bioterrorism, or unethical use of new technologies, next time we need to be better prepared. Both national governments and international institutions need to use strategic forecasting more systematically. Of course, the paradox here is that taking that step already requires some degree of strategic or long-term vision. Dear colleagues, as you know, the OSCE leadership jointly supported UN Secretary General Guterres' call for a universal ceasefire. Unfortunately, I fear this plea has not been heard in our part of the world. The window of opportunity for peace that it opened is, I'm afraid, quickly closing. In our region, the pandemic is having an impact on conflicts, on the civilian populations affected by them, and on the various formats attempting to address them. Conflict resolution has become harder, and progress has slowed clearly. The pandemic has had a disruptive effect on the OSCE's work in Ukraine. The good news is that both the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, the SMM, and the OSCE Project Coordinator in Ukraine have been able to adapt their operations and continue to implement their respective mandates, as has the observation mission at the 2 Russian checkpoints. Unfortunately, daily ceasefire violations in eastern Ukraine remain in the hundreds, and civilians continue to suffer from this conflict. SMM monitors are under growing risk as well, with more and more shooting or shelling incidents near SMM patrols and regular targeting of SMM UAVs, even when security guarantees have been provided for facilitating windows of silence. This, dear colleagues, cannot continue. The SMM also continues to face serious freedom of movement restrictions in non-government controlled areas. These hamper and bring into question the sustainability of our operations, including its monitoring work and efforts to facilitate humanitarian repairs to critical infrastructure. I understand that COVID-19 presents new challenges that must be addressed, and the SMM has already taken a range of measures to mitigate and manage the risks to mission members and to civilians. But let me be clear, the SMM should be enabled to fulfill the mandate which has been agreed by all participating states. The pandemic has also disrupted the negotiation formats dealing with the conflicts. The Trilateral Contact Group and its 4 working groups working toward peace in eastern Ukraine now meet exclusively by video conference. Unfortunately, the current dynamics continue to challenge progress towards implementation of the recommendations set out at the December summit of the Normandy 4. Sides seem to focus mainly on formalistic and procedural aspects instead of trying to produce substantive outcomes. Clearly, the need to conduct these meetings in a virtual format adds further to the challenge. The Transnistrian settlement process has also been heavily affected by the pandemic. Although the mission to Moldova and Special Representative Thomas Meyer-Harting remain very active, the regular working groups and meetings between the chief negotiators of the sides have been disrupted. The Geneva international discussions to address the consequences of the 2008 conflict in Georgia have also stopped, with no clear indication as to when they might resume, although here again the OSCE, UN and EU co-chairs and their teams continue very actively to engage with all participants to at least sustain communications and to look for opportunities. And the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs dealing with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict are also now relying on maintaining communication channels, while the monitoring work of the personal representative of the CIO, Andrei Kasparcic, and his team has been suspended. Dear colleagues, now let me turn to how the pandemic has affected the OSCE itself and how we have responded, both to maintain business continuity and to protect the health and safety of our staff and the communities where they work. At the core of the organization's mandate is providing platforms for inclusive diplomatic dialogue. Thanks to video conferencing and, I must say, to the great work of the Secretariat's conference and language services, as well as the ICT section, we have ensured that the Permanent Council, the Forum for Security Cooperation, and all their key committees and working groups can continue to meet online. Our field operations have also quickly adapted to the new situation, offering both a range of short-term and medium-term support to their host countries. For example, in the short term, they have variously provided personal protection equipment, support for vulnerable communities, and awareness-raising materials to prevent gender-based violence. Emerging themes for medium to longer-term support include crisis management and preparedness, corruption prevention, work on gender-related impacts of the crisis, and in particular gender-based violence, increased focus on combating human trafficking, and in particular in Central Asia, border management issues related to COVID-19. Dear colleagues, protecting the health and safety of our staff, as well as of our host communities, remains my top priority. In mid-March, I set up a Secretariat crisis management team to develop instructions and guidelines for ensuring duty of care to our staff while maintaining business continuity in line with local conditions and requirements. On the 16th of March, the Secretariat instituted remote working modalities for all, but a small handful of essential staff. And since the 3rd of April, all OSCE executive structures have fully implemented remote working, with exceptions only for those structures where physical presence is required on the ground to ensure mandate implementation. And this is, of course, mainly monitoring. The crisis management team met last Wednesday again, and the meeting focused on possible further stages of easing these restrictions. We continue to closely monitor the situation in all locations where the OSCE has a presence, and we will adopt accordingly. For example, as Austria has eased its restrictions, starting last week, the Secretariat has begun to allow a gradual return to our premises by staff on a voluntary basis. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that we operate in very, very different environments. While, as I said, here in Austria, things look already relatively bright. In other sub-regions of the OSCE, in Central Asia, for instance, we haven't even reached the peak yet. So we'll have to adapt to these very different realities in the weeks and months to come. But I would say all in all, the OSCE reacted quickly and quite effectively to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet again, the organization has demonstrated its flexibility and its responsiveness in face of crisis. We will certainly learn many lessons from this experience, which can help us ensure that the OSCE is well prepared to deal with future crises. In conclusion, I wish to thank you, George, President Serratelli, once again for having me here. And I would also like to thank Secretary General Montella for the continued excellent cooperation between both secretariats. And I do hope that we can soon meet in person again, be it in Copenhagen or here in Vienna. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Back to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Thank you very much, dear Thomas. This was really all-encompassing, and our members really appreciate it. And you already have 3 questions. I also just want to take 1 minute to thank you, Thomas, very much for the support that you've provided to our office in Vienna, and for also the continued communication that we have. Also, the modus operandi that you've set for the Secretariat is also a little bit a model for us, to follow. So thank you very much. I think we have really been successful in establishing an excellent cooperation with you, our 2 respective secretaries, but also with the other OSCE autonomous institutions. And I think this is a good example of how the OSCE family should work together. And I think for future reference, I think also the members of the OSCE Permanent Council who yesterday finally approved the budget. I don't know if I have to congratulate you on this. It comes 5 months later, but finally that problem is behind us now. But I hope that they also see that this organization, as you said, is really flexible, is immediately ready to deploy, and can easily adapt. So there is a lot of value in this organization. Now, I'll give back the floor to Secretary General Greminger.
Roberto, thank you, dear colleagues, for your comments and questions. I'll try to be concise, not to take too much of your time. Let me perhaps start first with your remark regarding the budget, Roberto. Yes, of course, I'm happy that we have finally an adopted unified budget for this year. But again, we were not in the mood to celebrate for a number of reasons. I think it cannot be normal that an organization has its budget approved well, close to mid-year. This cannot be, I think, an accepted standard. Second, it's not a good budget. We are again being asked to do more with less. It's a zero nominal growth budget. That it implies if you deduct inflation, if you deduct those increases that are not on our control, and there are, for instance, quite considerable increases in staff costs, again, that are totally out of our control. If you deduct that, you basically get, in real terms, about 2% less resources than the previous year. And this is now the 9th consecutive year that we are doing this. So again, not a reason to celebrate, even though, of course, I'm pleased to see us finally, in a position to go beyond monthly allotments and again have the entire budget available. Now, to the questions that Vice President Guliev, a broad set of questions. I start with a few pointers on a very challenging, a very comprehensive question, how to revitalize multilateralism. Well, I think we, as international organizations, we need to make a business case for cooperative approaches to solving global problems. I think we need to convince our constituencies that indeed for transnational, international cooperative answers. And in that sense, the pandemic is an opportunity to prove this case. It is also clear that we need to make our organizations more responsive, and that is also what I have been trying to do under the heading of Fit for Purpose, conduct reforms related to management processes, to budget, human resource policies, gender, etc. But then at the end of the day, we also need enlightened political leaders that are ready to pick up multilateral tools and use them, use platforms for dialogue, use tools to find joint answers to transnational challenges. Connectivity. Indeed, I think the pandemic has once more highlighted the relevance of promoting connectivity, of supporting, for instance, participating states in managing the digitalization. And here clearly you see in the OSCE subregions that still have enormous needs in that respect. We, and sir, you're probably aware, we are supporting a major project that aims at greening ports around the Caspian Sea. This is an initiative that very much works on promoting connectivity along the Caspian Sea, but including also with dry ports in Central Asia. And we are about now to venture into the second phase of this project. And I think it's about to become a flagship endeavor of our organization. And finally, your questions are related to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Well, I just had a chance to talk to the Minsk co-chairs a couple of weeks ago, and they reassured me that they indeed managed to maintain communication among the sides. They have been conducting online meetings with the ministers of foreign affairs, but at the same time, they also clearly have cautioned that online, what you can do is maintain communication, but you cannot progress in terms of substance. So for this, in-person meetings, again, need to take place. There has been a relatively ambitious agenda laid out in January by the Minsk co-chairs, and they're quite confident that once in-person meetings are possible again, that this ambitious agenda can be taken up again. It's about advancing in terms of confidence building measures. There are a number of confidence building measures that have been agreed. Other are still to be agreed. But then, of course, we also want to see progress on settlement-related issues. And but all of this, I think, only really makes sense when respective governments continue to prepare their populations for peace. I think that is very fundamental. The co-chairs, of course, they're the mediators, they're important, but they depend on political commitments of the parties to the conflict, and they depend on governments willing to prepare their populations for peace, and this basically implies also for compromise. Margareta, you're absolutely right. COVID-19, of course, affects all three dimensions of security, and there is currently a process in our organization to look into these different aspects. All the committees have taken up assessments to how does COVID-19 affect different aspects of human dimension related commitments. The first committee, they all have been conducting meetings, first meetings, trying to figure out how COVID affects security in our area and how we can support participating states in tackling these challenges. You have referred to some very important ones. Indeed, media freedom. Arlem Desir, the representative on the freedom of media, is of course very much challenged these days. On the one hand, yes, by fake news, disinformation. How can you cope with fake news, disinformation? But then, on the other hand, what we have also seen is states, limiting, restricting the freedom of media. And here, of course, the issue is: are these means, are they proportionate? Are they time bound? And so, in a nutshell, indeed, COVID-19 has brought up very significant challenges to media freedom. You rightly refer to vulnerable groups that are affected, or proportionately affected by the COVID crisis, and migrants clearly fall into this category. You have, and rightly so, referred to women and the significant rise in domestic violence. And this has been also a line of action by all of us on the policy level. We have issued, as you know, President Serreteli, the ODIHR director, and we have quite early on in the crisis, we have issued quite a strong statement on it. But we have also, through our field operations, supported participating states in dealing with this challenge. And yeah, and this takes me to underlining what fantastic assets our field operations are in supporting states to cope with COVID-19 related challenges. We can see this very well. Vice President Dobre, you asked about lessons learned. I think there are a number of things that we can already deduct from our crisis management efforts. But at the same time, I think we should, once the crisis is more or less over, we should, of course, also systematically try to assess our crisis management and draw lessons learned. But when it comes to issues related to the third dimension, democracy, rule of law, human rights, I think here the issue clearly is attempts to restrict human rights, fundamental freedoms, undermine democratic institutions in the framework of crisis management. And I think we have seen that ODIHR, the High Commission on National Minorities, but also the representative on the freedom of media, they've been, from day on, been assessing, systematically mapping, and also doing a lot of advocacy to point to these challenges, and also to flag to participating states that whenever measures restricting these rights, freedoms, institutions are taken, that they should be proportionate and that they should be time bound. And I think this is an effort that needs to go on until the crisis is over. And so clearly in that sense, again, I think OSCE institutions, OSCE tools have proven to be very, very valuable and quite responsive to the crisis. But then again, I'm not sure if I understood you rightly. You also referred to streamlining the organization. Here again, I would say, since the crisis clearly affects all three dimensions of our comprehensive approach to security, we also see how valuable this comprehensive approach to security is. So I wouldn't single out, one dimension against another. It is, I think, important to have a strong response in all three dimensions, and also in terms of cross-dimensional challenges. With this, I hand it back to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Thomas. This was, again, very nice, and you answered all the questions.